So thanks everybody for joining this month's British Society for Geomorphology lunchtime seminar. Just a few points before I introduce the speaker. The presentation will be recorded. At present, I think everybody is joining muted, so if you can just make sure that you are muted when Helen talks, that'll be great. Any questions, you can either use the chat as you go as an aide-memoire, or we'll have questions and discussions at the end. So today it's our great pleasure to introduce Dr. Helen Jay from the National Trust. Helen is a coastal geomorphologist in training and spent the first part of her career in engineering consultancy, working on shoreline management plans and all manner of other coastal geomorphological problems. But in recent years, she's moved to the National Trust. And the talk today is called Forever Shifting Shores, National Trust's Work on the Coast, and will present an update of their Shifting Shores policy. So over to you, Helen. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul, and thanks for inviting me to talk today. And I hope everyone's enjoying a really good lunch. And although my talk today is probably a little bit less technical than some of the other presentations so far in this year's series, I hope you'll all find it interesting. And if nothing else, maybe the photographs of some of the wonderful places we look after will help transport you away from your spreadsheets, business cases, or whatever else you might be working on at the moment. So as Paul said, I'm the Senior National Consultant for Coast for the National Trust, and whilst my background is in coastal geomorphology, my current role really seems to encapsulate anything with the word coast in it, from coastal litter to seals to actually doing some work in coastal geomorphology still. So over the next 40 or so minutes, I'll give you a little bit of a flavour of the National Trust at the coast, and particularly focusing on our coastal adaptation work and our work with others. So firstly, to introduce us a little bit, so we're an organisation that was founded back in 1895 by 3 individuals who really recognised the threats to our natural landscapes, predominantly from development. With our staff, members and volunteers, we're now the largest conservation charity in Europe, and we look after a range of historical sites, countryside, green spaces, and that's across England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Happily, we don't look after Scotland, although that was a slight fear when I first took on the job and got contacted by someone from Scotland who said, "Oh, we need to chat." That would be doubling our coastline probably. We also do link up with other conservation organisations across the world through INTO, which is our International National Trust organisation. So in terms of the coast we look after, across the whole of England, Wales and Northern Ireland, in our remit, both terrestrial and coastal, we look after 250,000 hectares of land, and you can see these on the map shown as green blobs. About 20% of this we class as coastal land, so that's land that's within 1 kilometre of the coast or up to roughly tidal limits on estuaries. That equates to over 890 miles of coastline. The majority of our land sits above mean high water, but we also do own about 8,000 hectares of intertidal and seabed, including roughly half of Stramford Loch in Northern Ireland. As well as our countryside, we also own around 92 car parks, 20 cafes and many shops and buildings at the coast. Our coastal sites are also incredibly important for the heritage that they feature, such as Salter Lighthouse, which you can see in the top left there, in Tyne and Wear, and mine buildings in that second photo along the Tyn coast in Cornwall. And also highlighted in the photos above are the incredible seascapes, such as the iconic Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland, the sweeping beaches of Scilly Bay in the Gower, South Wales, and that amazing sand and gravel feature of Blakeney Point, illustrating some really lovely recurves there. So the coast has featured in our portfolio of properties since the very beginning, and in fact the very first piece of land that was gifted to us was a strip of coastal land overlooking Barmouth in Wales. And we have since received donations and made acquisitions, but it was really in the 1960s when our acquisitions at the coast really grew. This was driven by concern regarding growing pressures from development, including expansion of towns and tourism. And in order to understand more about the scale of the problem, the National Trust commissioned a piece of work, and this was carried out by a lecturer from the University of Reading, Dr John Whitto, and a group of 33 students who set out in May 1965 to survey the whole coastline of England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And with the limited technology they had at the time, they trekked around the coast, camping in tents and colouring in hundreds of Ordnance Survey maps. And they characterised both the quality of the coast and also the potential threats. And this is an example of one of their hand-coloured maps for the northeast England. And from this analysis, Dr Whitto found that about a third of the total coastline was in pristine condition, but in need of protection from encroaching development and over-tourism. And he recommended to the National Trust that they acquire 900 miles of coast, which we're pretty much approaching now. And this very much promoted the launch of our Neptune Coast campaign in 1965, and this campaign's been running since. Interestingly, some of the stretches of coast that were deemed beyond redemption in the 1965 survey have also since been bought by the Trust. And this really emphasises that change in attitudes over time, that we're actually moving away from some of the pristine areas, because many of these are now protected by statutory designations or owned by ourselves or other nature conservation bodies, and have been looking at some of those other areas where we can maximise benefit for nature and people. And so some of the examples of more recent acquisitions was the Durham coastline, which was purchased in 1990. And this was once black with coal waste, but actually undertook a transformational programme restoring those beaches. A second example is the peninsula of Orford Ness in Suffolk, which was a military testing ground. So moving forward, another 30 years from that survey that was undertaken, a new challenge for the Trust was really emerging from the risk associated with rising sea levels and increased risk of flooding. And following DEFRA's publication of the Future Coast Study, the Trust decided to make an assessment of risks to our own properties from coastal change. This used the output from Future Coast, which predated NSERM, National Coastal Erosion Risk Mapping, and also the first iteration of NAFRA, the National Flood Risk Assessment. And thus, this analysis revealed that over 50% of our coastal properties would experience moderate to extreme coastal erosion within the century, with many more already at risk from tidal flooding. And based on this, an initial 90 hotspots were identified. This is where we thought we needed to think more carefully about how we might manage the sites in the future. It also prompted us to rethink about what the long-term future of coastal management might look for us at the Trust. And we launched our Shifting Shores policy in 2005. And this committed, critically, the Trust to adapting to coastal change. Its aim was to encourage our coastal properties and others to develop those really long-term plans for the coast, moving away from preserving things as they are. The Shifting Shores principle really sets out the direction we should take and starts very much from a different place. In the past, we might have thought, well, can we continue to hold the line here? And if we can't, what if? Whereas Shifting Shores flipped it on its head to say, we should look to adapt here. And that's predominantly what we should do unless we decide otherwise. So the original principles set out by Shifting Shores are shown here on the left, and they remain valid and underpin the work that we do today. So working with, not against nature, wherever we can, promoting that adaptive approach, recognising that whilst we might not need to respond immediately, we need to plan for the future and also address some of those actions that are necessary in order to support future decisions. Thinking and acting in that wider concept, recognising that the coast doesn't have boundaries. What we do on our coast affects others, whether that's longshore or offshore or inshore, and vice versa. What others do can affect our management options. Planning for the long term, so thinking forward to what the future might hold for our coastlines and also what we might ask of our coastlines in the future. involving the public and communities, so recognising that what we do affects those around us. And also, if we don't bring the public and communities into our decisions, we can't ensure that they are just and fair for those communities. And then finally, working in partnership. So recognising that we are not working in isolation, that we sit within that wider political and legislative framework, but also there are many around us who have some brilliant ideas, and only by working together can we jointly fulfil those longer term ambitions for our coast. So I mentioned earlier that we looked at 90 hotspots, and these hotspots have grown in number over time. And for these hotspots, we've developed our own coastal adaptation strategies. And this is really to drive that long-term thinking. And they are established around these principles set out here. So they're always designed to be locally led. That brings in both understanding of nuances at a local site, but also brings in that local ownership of those plans. Defining a long-term vision for the property. What do we want that property to look at like at the moment, in the future? What will be its function in the future? To understand and capture some of those key issues, but also look at some of the opportunities that might arise from coastal change and managing that coastal change in a different way. Defining some of the actions to address some of those issues and also release some of those opportunities, and also highlighting the optimum outcomes, so really understanding what we're expecting those actions to deliver. So this is really to drive that proactive rather than reactive management, making sure that we're not caught in a trap that if something happens in the future, we behave in a certain manner to address that. It also informs our future planning and our financial investments. So thinking about where we might want to acquire land in the future, for example, to allow space for nature to roll back into, but also whether we want to invest in certain properties or certain facilities, or whether we need to rethink, for example, a toilet block and where it sits on a coastline. And Shifting Shores has really played a strong role in informing both our internal and also our external advocacy work. So the CAS themselves are really quite simple documents. They're framed around these key themes featured here, and this is really to ensure we capture all the elements that we want to and that we see as important for our coastal sites. And then for each theme, we identify the issues, associated actions, and those optimum outcomes, and also define these in terms of whether they're short-term or medium actions or even long-term. And so in terms of short term, we'll be thinking in the next few years. Medium term aligns to our internal strategy, which is 10 years, and then long term beyond that 10-year period. So in terms of some of the challenges we're facing, well, I'm sure these won't come as a surprise to any of you. We are facing increasing sea levels, increased precipitation. Oh, I'm getting lunch delivered, which is very nice. Thank you, yeah.
Yep.
Thank you. And changes in storm patterns. And in combination with ageing defences, they have potential to directly impact our coast and the infrastructure located there. And I'm just showing some photos here of some of that infrastructure that's potentially at risk. So the first picture here is our site at Burnham Overy Staithe in North Norfolk. And you should just be able to make out on this building a small white brick. This actually shows the height the water got to in the infamous 1953 storm surge event. Now, obviously, there's been investment in defences since, but this provides us with a little bit of a benchmark of what we might need to plan for in the future. The second photo is from Studland Bay on the Dorset coast, and here we've been experiencing increasing damage from storm events over the last few years, with lowering of those fronting beaches and undermining, and these are really much beloved assets which will ultimately become unsustainable in their current position in the future. The top photo is Mullion Harbour in Cornwall, and this original structure, which is also a heritage asset, dates from the 1890s. It was built to create a safe haven for fishermen on an otherwise treacherous coast. and it continues to support and protect a small community. But since its construction, it has suffered damage, and ultimately in the future, we need to think of a different future for this. So we're working really closely with that community to think about that transition forward through time. And then the last example here at the bottom is Compton Bay on the Isle of Wight, where, as many of you will know, a combination of marine erosion and slope stability is resulting in really rapid change along this coastline. And this photo is actually already out of date because over the past year, we've been relocating our car park further inland and allowing this coast now to evolve as it wishes. But recognising that relocation of our car park is only really a measure that will buy us time. But it's not only the infrastructure that is facing challenges, we're also seeing challenges for the habitat and species that are supported along our coastlines. And the example here on the left is from our site at Copt Hall in Essex. And here we're seeing that embankments are preventing the landward migration of salt marsh under sea level rise. And we're seeing that intertidal squeeze, so reduction in that intertidal area, the salt marsh in front, and also some internal erosion of that salt marsh. The bottom photo on the right hand side is from Dunwich and Minsmere, and again we have embankment fronted here by a shingle barrier and backed by freshwater marshes. And I've put this in really to highlight sort of that conundrum that faces us when we're thinking about habitats on our coast. That freshwater brackish habitat behind the embankment, which forms part of, oh, I can't see current slides. Paul, can you see the slides?
No, they're fine. I'm just responding. I think he needs to switch it off and then on again.
Brilliant, thank you. So yeah, the photo of Minsmere and Dunwich, this really shows that conundrum I was talking about, where we have freshwater and brackish habitat behind, which is part of the RSP reserve here. But to maintain that, we would be then losing that critical vegetated shingle habitat in front. So what do we do in the future, and how do we manage that transitional change for habitat? And squeeze of our beaches and intertidal areas also increases pressure on some of our critical species. And although it's quite well hidden, you can see a little ringed plover on the beach here. And what we're seeing is, as our beaches are narrowing, and as our beaches are becoming increasingly popular for visitors, we're seeing their habitats being squeezed out. They're facing increased risk from disturbance, and that's affecting them as a species. So sort of thinking about how change of our coast affects our species is also part of some of the issues we're facing into. And it's not just changes to our marine environment that we need to consider at the Trust. We're also facing challenges from additional climate related issues. And the photo here is from Purbeck on the Dorset coast, and this shows the impact of a wildfire a couple of years ago. Now, whilst most of these are started by humans, either deliberately or accidentally, research suggests that there's going to be a projected increase, a global increase of extreme fires of up to 15% by 2030, 30% by 2050, and an incredible 50% by the end of the century. The example here was had an additional element of excitement for the general manager looking after the site, because this is where we had a lot of military action during World War I and World War II, and therefore quite a lot of risk of an exploded ordnance. So it's quite an exciting day for the GM, I think, on that day. The second photo here is from Mount Stewart in Northern Ireland, and a key challenge experience here is from seawater intrusion due to rising water levels within Stramford Loch. The salt water presents a real threat to the world famous gardens at this site. So again, as part of our adaptation planning, we're thinking about how we might relocate those gardens further up the coast, and thinking about how long that process is likely to take us, restoring some of those seed banks and trying to preserve an incredibly important resource. So how do we respond to changes at the coast? At a very high level, there are three possible responses. We could resist change, so we can make our defences wider and higher. We can hold the current line and preserve the current landscape, but accepting that that marine environment is still going to be changing. And so as we look into the future, we're going to need those defences to be even higher and even bigger. But this is going to be a predominant option for many of our developed frontages. We can accept change, so we can accept those increasing risks, accept loss and damage due to flooding and erosion, and accept some of that environmental change. Or we can change how we manage our coast. We can think about rolling back, realigning defences, adapting our management approaches, building resilience where we can, undertaking more habitat restoration, embracing some of those environmental changes and building that into our planning. And so at the National Trust, we tend to be working within that accept and that change space, although we do have locations where we are still needing to maintain our defences in order to protect critical infrastructure or properties at our coast. So in the next few slides, I'm just going to be talking about three locations and just talking about the different approaches that we've been taking here, working with others in partnership. The first location is Dinistintler. This is the location of a coastal hill fort, which you can just see on the mound in the photo here, which is likely to date from around the Iron Age. It's a site of national importance and is protected as both a scheduled monument and also a site of special scientific interest for its geological significance. It's also fronted by a shingle band, and you can see some lovely vegetated shingle habitat there. So it's located on the Llen Peninsula in North Wales, and Dinistintler is actually a small village located within a flood risk area just to the north of the hill fort. You can just see that the pink outline there is our property boundary, and Dinistintler are the houses just to the north of that. The hill fort itself was constructed on a mound of glacial moraine, and as you can see from the photo, has been experiencing erosion. And we were really lucky for this site to be included in the Cherished project. This was an EU-funded project looking into change and coastal heritage across Wales and Ireland. It was led by the Royal Commission in partnership with the Discovery Programme of Ireland, Aberystwyth University, and also the Geological Survey of Ireland. And the image shown here is actually one that was captured by drone survey and taken at the outset of the project as that baseline record. And you can see the very active erosion of the cliffs here. And because the cliffs are cut into this complex glacial deposits, the cliffs are susceptible to erosion through both wave action at the toe, which varies quite a lot along the shoreline, and also instability due to overland and groundwater flows. There also is a human influence on the rate of erosion, as you can see in this aerial photo here. So we had some fishtail groins that were constructed in the 1990s to protect the village of Dinistintler, and these have had the added benefit of actually protecting the hill fort as well by building up the beach behind those defences. But of course, as we look to future changes in how that management might be undertaken, we'll also see a potential response in terms of future rates of erosion at the hill fort. So in terms of the Cherished project, they used a whole range of techniques to try and build up a history of the site. So they used historical maps to chart rates of erosion since the 1900s using historical ordnance surveys. And this suggested that between 20 and 40 metres of the western side of the hill fort had been lost over the last 100 years. And the eroding cliff top is now approximately 9 metres from the archaeological features that they excavated as part of the project. So therefore this puts these features at risk within the next couple of decades, although the site as a whole will remain for a fair while beyond this. So in terms of some of the other work they carried out, they undertook drone surveys, laser, LiDAR surveys, as well as rope access examination. And what was really interesting about this project is that it brought together both archaeologists and geomorphologists to really understand how this site has evolved over time, both naturally and human occupation. And through this work, they've managed to build up a really detailed picture of how the landscape has changed and also how it's likely to change in the future. And this has allowed these fantastic reconstructions through images. These have played a really key role in working with communities and schools and has enabled us to talk not only about the history of the site, but also coastal geomorphology and coastal evolution, as well as future climate change. This site is also a demonstrator project because we have a number of assets around our coasts which are heritage at risk, but where construction of defences would be either inappropriate or unaffordable or both. And so this project demonstrates how we can do loss well through monitoring and recording, which is often referred to as preservation by record. It also showed the value of bringing together different peoples, so geomorphologists, archaeologists, and communities and schools to bring together that story of coastal change in a way that was really connected with that local community. And a final interesting element to the story was the decision that we wouldn't rebury the feature that was excavated. And you can just see in the top right here, the remains of the archaeological dig here. And a decision was taken to consolidate these remains, whereas usually they would be recovered at the end of a dig. And part of this decision was really recognising that this feature has a short lifespan going forward. As I said, it's currently around 9 metres from the cliff edge. So recognising that a real value of this project was keeping that exposed, allowing people to visit the site and really engage with the heritage at this location. So I'm now going to transport you to the east coast of England to a very different place, an island called Northey Island. Now, whilst this is also a land steeped in history, this being the site of one of the oldest recorded battlefields, the Battle of Maldon in 1991, the main focus of our work here has been around securing a future of the island as a secure refuge for nature and in particular overwintering and wading birds. So these maps just show the locations. So it's in the Blackwater estuary near Chelmsford in Essex. And the island can be accessed from the mainland from a tidal causeway. And you can just make it out in this, in the left photo, just in the bottom left-hand corner. But the causeway is covered for up to 3 hours either side of the high tide. So it's quite a mysterious land to be on during high tide events. The island is surrounded by salt marsh, which is more extensive on the eastern side, and it only rises up to about 8 metres maximum in height. But it does support, as part of that, an area of freshwater grazing. The Blackwater estuary itself is a SSSI for its natural habitat and geomorphological features, and is internationally important for its overwintering bird populations, including Brent geese. The intertidal habitats surrounding the island are also designated as special protection areas, SPAs, and special areas of conservation, SACs, for various species of seabirds, including ringed plover and dunlin. And in the past, the area of dry land that made up the island was much larger, and you can just make out on that left-hand photo, around the outside of the current salt marsh area are the remnants of the outer embankments that used to be here. They were abandoned approximately 100 years ago following extreme surge events, but you can still see them and they are still having an impact on this salt marsh behind them. What's really interesting is that if you zoom into the photo, you can actually see some of the plough lines across that salt marsh, which is retained still. So the figure on the right shows some of the different elements of the project that we've undertaken here. It was actually the site of the very first mandatory alignment in the UK in 1991, down at the southern end of the island. And this was really considered an innovative approach at the time. It involved removing that fronting embankment and realigning it landwards onto agricultural land. And it's really undertaken recognising that the cost of maintaining the embankment here could not be justified for the land it was protecting. It resulted in creation of around 1 hectare of new salt marsh. And then in 2013, the Environment Agency withdrew maintenance of the remaining flood embankments. But by this time, many of the embankments were already being overtopped. We also noted around this time that there was erosion and decay of the salt marsh around the island. It was occurring through widening of the main creeks, internal expansion of smaller creeks, and expansion of mud pans. So really some internal rot of the salt marsh was taking place. So Northey had already been identified on our list of 90 key sites. And recognising that the real long-term risk to Northey Island and its critical habitats it supports, a phased adaptation plan was developed. The key aim of this plan is to retain, create and sustain salt marsh habitat over the next 100 years. And it was really recognised that if we didn't do this work, that almost all the salt marsh would be lost within the next century. Through our phased approach, we aim to secure around 50 to 60 hectares of the current salt marsh, which currently lies around 90 hectares, so just over half. Oh, I'll just go back, sorry. So sort of looking at the work that we've undertaken here, and starting first at some of the managed realignment schemes. I've mentioned the 1991. If you carry on down the coast, we had our 2019. And this managed realignment involved removing the southern part of the bank. Here we'd been experiencing significant deterioration and loss of the salt marsh due to coastal squeeze. Following removal of the bank, this area has been left to vegetate naturally, and I'll show you that in the next couple of photos, which you've already had a snapshot of. There is rising land behind this, which means that by removing this bank, that salt marsh habitat can now migrate inland as sea level rises. So it can go upslope across the agricultural land that still exists there at the moment. Then in 2023, we did a second phase of managed realignment, and at this time we removed 2 lengths of bank. So this is the yellow area shown on the west-hand side of the island there. The eastern side of the island there. As part of these works, we also excavated a number of creeks, so created a new creek network to influence the flow of water in and out of those realignment areas. Now, the point of this realignment is to allow both regeneration of salt marsh in those areas, but also to provide a little bit more accommodation space and relieve pressure on the remaining existing salt marsh. We also constructed a small closing bank on the top of the scheme, just to prevent those flows from south to north across the island. So again, this is really part of that transitional planning, that we don't need to do everything now. It's really building up that future for the island. So here are those photos from the 2019 realignment. So in the top left, that was soon after the works, and you can just see that demonstration of new vegetation coming in. Now, this is without any new seeding or planting having been undertaken. All this material has come in by tides and winds. You can also see the rising land behind. So this is where the salt marsh will gradually migrate to under rising sea levels. And these slides show the location of the 2023 works. The realignment itself took place in spring 2023, but we actually had about 2 years of work before then to prepare for those works. And on the left-hand side, these are just some habitat mapping that was undertaken to try and understand what might evolve here in the future without those defences in place. So the yellow shows the area between mean high water springs and highest astronomical tide. So this is the zone of transitional habitats, such as reed beds. The green shows the area between mean high water springs and mean high water neap, so that salt marsh, mid to lower salt marsh. And the brown that you can see in the second photo is mean low water springs to mean high water neaps, so mud flat to low marsh. At the top photo here is 2018 tidal levels, and the bottom one is including around 100 years of sea level rise. So you can just see that transitional change that we'll be expecting in the future. So in terms of the works that were undertaken, we removed 200 metres of embankment down to ground level to allow floodwaters to come in from that southeastern side. And then we also lowered a section of bank on the eastern side here. Now that was only lowered, so it only overtops during the highest tides, and this acts as a little bit of a pressure valve on the system. We didn't want to open up this full area because of the potential for flows to be concentrated, and which would potentially erode that existing salt marsh in front. To the north of this area, we've also done some bank reprofiling. So this is really to sort of manage that change to this area. As in the top of the photo, you can see some properties. So this is some old houses on the island and heritage features. So as part of the bank reprofiling work, we use material for the managed realignment areas to reshape the banks here. In their current state, they were very steep. And what we were seeing is when these banks were overtopped during high tides, they would cause scour behind and also made them more prone to catastrophic failure. So using material from that managed realignment area, which again had the benefit of us not having to remove any material from the site, we were able to reshape these to a much lower but wider profile. So as water passes over them, the energy is taken out, and it also has that greater potential to bring sediment into that site. So accepting that in the future, this will become increasingly more frequently flooded, but will always already be warping up the area by that influx of sediment over time. We've also undertaken some BUDS work at Northern Island. So this refers to beneficial use of dredged sediment, and it's the salt marsh equivalent of beach recharge, but with the added benefit that it uses material from capital dredging, i.e. dredging that takes place in ports and navigation channels, which would otherwise be considered as waste materials. So the first area that we placed material was in the northwestern part of the island, shown in green here on the map. And this was undertaken as emergency works back in 2016. There was real concern at this time that a channel was developing in this part of the island, which would have effectively beheaded the island. And we foresaw that this would then promote very active erosion of the salt marsh here, but also potentially affect flows within that wider estuary, potentially affecting the mainland behind as well. We then went on and undertook some more BUDS work along the western shore there, shown in blue, and also along the causeway, again recognising that causeway plays a fairly critical role in how flows work around the island and risks to the mainland. And then most recently, we're undertaking some works on the east of the island, shown in the pink dot, and this is to create some new bird habitat over in this area of salt marsh. So just to illustrate those BUDS works, this is in that northwest area. So the material is brought from Malden Dock, so it's about 2 miles away from the coast, which also has made licensing issues a lot easier. It's then placed on the shoreline, allowed to dewater, and then is reprofiled. We've also created these fingers of sediment that extend into the salt marsh just to prevent any concentration of flows within those back channels, which could cause a similar effect that we were concerned about in 2016. So the material is mostly mud and silt that we bring it in. And by placing it here, we reduce the tidal flow over the top of that bank during the highest of spring tides and surge events. And that effectively protects that salt marsh behind and also reduces the risk of breach here. Again, here we don't do any active seeding or planting. And what the team have found on the ground is actually plants come in even quicker than in those managed realignment areas. So since 2016, we've actually seen this area starting to accrete. So we've placed around 2,200 metres cubed of material, but we've seen an additional 2,000 metres cubed accretion here. And this is the BUDS work that we're undertaking on the western shore. And this work was really to address some of that marsh erosion that we were seeing happening along the shoreline. So this is more to create that sacrificial buffer of material. So work started here at the end of 2024, and we're just placing it along the shoreline to create that protective barrier. Then finally on this site, we also undertake extensive monitoring of habitat, species and the morphological change that's taken place. We undertake regular drone surveys, and this is just an output for one of those. And these drone surveys collect topographic, red, green, blue imagery and also multispectral reflectance data. So it enables us to look at those habitats and vegetation types that are evolving on this site. We also conduct on the ground vegetation surveys, bird surveys, fish surveys, etc. as part of our business as usual monitoring of this site. So really building up that picture of change here and how the site is evolving as a result of all the studies and works that we're doing on this site. So we're moving away from the east coast now and moving back towards the west to the south coast of England, specifically to the stunning Studland Bay and Dorset coast. So Studland Bay is located within Poole Bay, and here we've been facing challenges of an eroding coast and loss of amenity beach in a really extremely popular visitor destination. The alignment of Poole Bay means that this site is predominantly sheltered from dominant and the largest waves from the southwest, but it is exposed to easterly and southeasterly waves which are generated within the English Channel. These waves tend to be shorter in period and less frequent, but significant storms can still occur. And also, as we've seen in some recent storm events such as Storm Kieran, when a low pressure sweeps up through the channel, it can generate strong onshore gusts and also really large destructive waves at the shoreline. So although most of the time this seems a very benign, very calm environment, it is prone to these bursts of activity and bursts of erosion during these extreme events. The sediment transport within this area is typically from south to north, so any sediment mobilised during storms is typically moved north of this area. And what we're finding is that it's not replenished from further south. So over time, what we've seen is the beach levels diminishing here, retreat to the coast, as shown in this image on the left-hand side, which maps the Historical Ordnance Survey high water lines over time, starting from the red, the oldest, up to the yellow, which is the most recent Ordnance Survey, and then the aerial image is from 2013 here. So we're seeing this deepening bay that's been occurring here. And this is also shown in the regional monitoring data with the red in this right-hand image showing area of erosion and the green showing areas of accretion as material from this southern area gets moved up and deposited in those areas to the north. So we're seeing a real rotation of this coast over time. And we also see this through our historical images, historical photographs, that the beaches here have generally been dropping and diminishing, putting a risk to our infrastructure here and also causing loss of that beach. So in order to address that, we had gabions and rock placed along the shoreline, and whilst these gabion baskets were effective in preventing that cliff erosion, what obviously they weren't doing is affecting what was happening on the in the seabed and intertidal area. So over time we've had increasing loss of beach here and probably accelerated by those defences due to reflection and scour in front of them. And so having looked at the coastal processes and looked at the geomorphology and how this coast is changing over time, we came to the decision that we needed to remove these defences. That hasn't been an easy process. It's involved making some really difficult decisions, some challenging conversations with our local communities to explain why we've taken this decision. We've also had to go through planning permissions and have those various debates. The work's also involved removal of a well-beloved cafe on the coast, as well as a toilet block and pumping station. So a lot of work has been taking place over the last few years to implement this change. But the photo here on the right shows the site last week. So we finally finished the works. So we've undertaken reprofiling of the site. All the assets have been removed. And now we're just waiting to see how nature will reshape this bay and hopefully create a new bay form which is more sustainable. And as part of our works, we've created this artist's impression of how we think the Middle Beach might look after nature reshapes it in the future. So what's next for the National Trust? What do we see the future bringing us? Well, I think we're probably sitting on that precipice of the next period of change. We are now facing into a backdrop of a changing climate, ever accelerating sea level rise, and the changes that that brings. But also we seem to be looking increasingly to our coasts and seas to work harder for us, whether that be through nature recovery, recognising that they support some really critical habitats which are facing pressures from climate change themselves, to looking to restore some of our blue habitats for carbon sequestration and recognising the role that they can play in terms of both habitats in their own right and also to mitigate the impacts of climate change. But our coasts are also incredibly important for coastal communities, with many of our coastal sites being some of the most deprived areas in the country. They're also key for industry and fisheries and play a really key role in terms of local economies, in terms of the tourism they support. As we look offshore, we're also looking to use our seas for our offshore renewables, and these also have an impact on our transitional zones because of onshore cabling. So I believe that we're now looking at a time where we need to do more and at a greater pace. We will need to involve working in partnership with other organisations who are impacted by coastal change, as well as the statutory and legislative bodies. We also probably need to look at implementing those changes at variable scales, from some of the small scale change that we can work together with communities on, to that really large scale catchment scale change. So looking at catchment to coast and how we can influence the whole system to make it better. And as demonstrated by our work at Northey, we need to think about the work we do as transitional plans, accepting that in places we will simply be buying time for people and nature, but allowing that time for us to think about further into the future. But all this will need continued and developing understanding of our coastal and estuary systems, underpinned, of course, by geomorphology. I can't avoid mentioning that for this group. And also bring in expertise from others. And as demonstrated by our work up at Dinnerstintler, there's a whole range of communities that we can bring in help from to think about how we manage our coasts in the future. So not only geomorphologists, but also nature conservationists, archaeologists, and social scientists across academia, government, consultancies, and practitioners. So no small ask, but it's for us to try and look to the future and see how we can improve our coasts for everyone. Thank you very much.
Super. Thanks, Helen. Lovely pictures. Interesting talk. Very thought-provoking. Right, there's a few questions in the chat. So if anybody else wants to post questions there, please do. So the first question from Yasmin Lee. She says, how did you figure out where the pressure points are at the national scale, and how do you how have you changed the realignment and the profiling of the coast to make it work? So let's focus on identifying pressure points. How have you identified the key areas and prioritized those?
Yeah, so we obviously have our mapping of our sites, and that was compared to the national data set. So at the time that was Future Coast and NSOM 1. Obviously we now have NSOM 2 and NAFRA 2, and we're currently going through a process of actually revisiting some of those pressure points. But to be honest, when I've looked at our coastal portfolios, I think every single coast needs to be included, that from different elements. My personal experience at the Trust is I was expecting Cornwall to be one of our quietest regions when I joined. I thought they're fine, it's all hard, that's fine. But actually in those areas, actually because we've not experienced change, some of our assets and our heritage features are incredibly close to the coastal edge. So even a metre of change through a rockfall can suddenly have quite considerable impact on some of those sites. So actually, I think it's everywhere. The challenge for us is then prioritising where we focus our efforts, and I would say that's an ongoing challenge for us. And again, it's working with other partners to do that, including some of our statutory agencies such as Natural England, DARA, NRW, and Historic England, etc., to help us define those.
Super. That leads on to the next question from Mandy Knott, who asks about funding of your projects. Is it exclusively from the income that the Trust has from membership and your charitable status?
It's we're funded in a number of different ways. So in terms of the Trust itself, we have our membership funding. For our work on the coast, we have our Neptune Coast campaign that I mentioned at the start, which draws in donations and legacies. And since 1965, that's raised around £14 million. So that obviously is quite a help. Our work at Northey, for example, has been funded through contributions from I think it was the last EU Life project in the UK, which enabled us to undertake some of that work there. We also use various other grants, so we have countryside stewardship schemes that we look to use. We have individual donations from philanthropy, and also we look to say Highways England, etc., as well as natural flood management funding as well. So a whole range of funding, from government to philanthropy to some of our internal sources.
Super. Okay. Just a question from me about dealing with public opinion. You know, as a charity with a large membership, clearly removing access to some sites because of a priority to give space to nature, or completely removing beach huts and cafes from places like Studland is clearly challenging. How have you taken the public on that journey, and presumably done it with public support?
I wouldn't say it's always with public support. It is a challenge, and I think a key thing with engaging with community is that it never ends. So it doesn't just end when you think the project has ended or come to an end. And certainly we found that at Million, where we spent several years talking to the community there, thought it was all settled and everyone was happy with the transition plan. And then, of course, the community changes slightly, new individuals come in and they challenge some of the elements that we thought had been resolved. So I think quite a lot of it is around being honest about some of the decisions we're making and why we're making them, and making that quite clear. So in some cases, it will be a financial decision. In other cases, it may be around providing that space for nature and explaining, you know, the biodiversity crisis. In other places, it's simply, we think, you know, restoring coastal processes there is going to bring the biggest benefit. So I think there's an element around honesty that you need to bring in. And it's trying to listen to all voices as well, because as any of us involved in public consultation are aware, the loudest voice isn't necessarily the most representative voice. So trying to bring in all those voices at a very early stage, I think, and understanding what people's concerns are, because sometimes they're not what you think they are. So even around access, it you know, we've got a recent example where actually when we went out to individuals who were challenging some of our ideas, it was because they were really annoyed by the cycle path being the same as the public footpath, which you sort of think, well, we can help resolve that. So yeah, understanding what people's concerns or gripes actually are.
Super.
Instead of making assumptions.
Yeah, interesting. Communication is always very important, isn't it? Final question then. Are you looking at applications of AI to support decision making on this, or are you still relying on old-fashioned experts?
I would say, like every organisation, we are looking to alternative tools moving forward. I think at the end of the day, AI doesn't help us with some of our actual on the ground talking to people, as we were saying. Communication tends to be better sort of on an individual basis, face to face. I think in terms of some of the analysis, yes, our AI will be increasingly important. It also enables us to run a number of scenarios quite quickly and process them to understand how changes might occur. So yes, I think like all organisations, we're looking at all tools that we can use as part of this challenge. So.
Super. We've got a few more questions, but I'll just ask one and then we'll wrap things up. So Steve McFarland says, does your approach help to influence other private landowners and their approaches to coastal management? You know, do you see yourselves as knowledge leaders in this area seeking to provide wider influence? And do you have that wider influence?
So Steve's the one who suggested I might be looking after National Trust Scotland, by the way.
Right.
I think we do play quite a big role in external advocacy, and we work hard to, for example, to embed ourselves in some of the Environment Agency funded FCRIP and CTAP projects, and work in that way. Sometimes we have to be a little bit wary because, as we were discussing, you know, we do have access to funds that others don't, and sometimes we've come into criticism for suggesting you do something in a certain way, which actually wouldn't be so easy for individuals. But I think we recognise that we really can't do this together, and we're increasingly moving towards more of a catchment to coast approach, which will then be bringing in a lot more private landowners into the conversations. And again, it's sort of understanding how we can work together to make potentially some small scale changes, but combined make that much bigger impact. So simple answer, yes, I hope we do influence others, but it's more working together rather than us telling them what to do is the best approach.
Good. Okay, there's a final question from Lucas. Do you need support and are you welcoming volunteers? I assume the answer is yes to that. And
yes, please.
Go to the website and you can find out.
No, we do have a good base of volunteers, not necessarily always at the coast. And in the past we have had sort of specific coastal champions. So that could be something that we look to introduce again. Like everything, COVID seemed to put a stopper on quite a lot of those sort of locally led initiatives. So yes, please.
Super.
And
okay.
Financial assistance also.
Never going to say no to that. Good. Okay. Well, thank you very much for giving the presentation, Helen. That was really interesting. Lovely photographs, very thought-provoking discussion as well. And thanks to everybody for joining and for the discussion. The presentation will be available on the BSG's YouTube site in due course. So thank you all, and we'll be in touch about the next event next month. Enjoy your lunches. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.